Hello and welcome back. We are talking about fiscal responsibility and good governance today. What does it mean to be fiscally responsible? Fiscal responsibility means we need to make sure that we reduce the deficits. Currently, here we are in October of 2025, and the government expenditure that we have is 40% above the amount of tax revenue that we are taking in. Currently, we are taking in around 6 to 7% GDP deficits relative to GDP, which is far outpaces the amount of GDP growth that we have as a country. And as a result, our debt to GDP ratio is increasingly getting higher and higher and higher. And preferably, you want the debt to GDP ratio to start to flatten or even preferably to start to decrease. Now, usually when people talk about the national debt, you'll hear people talk about the national debt, but they don't really, it's kind of hard to really imagine what the actual tangible long-term economic effects are. But we have some examples to go by. You can look at Greece in the 2008 fiscal crisis, where they had a prolonged period of time of fiscal irresponsibility. And you combine that with the fact that they actually partnered with Goldman Sachs to do a little bit of fuzzy reporting and fudge the numbers. And then all of it led up to a kind of collapse where where all the numbers revealed themselves and they recognized the untenability of their fiscal situation. So what they ended up having to do is they had to undergo some emergency, very harsh austerity. They had to take a bailout from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. They had to do some very harsh fiscal responsibility. They cut pensions severely. They had to throw a lot of elderly people off of their health care. They had the wages for everybody was decreased significantly. GDP growth declined significantly, and unemployment exploded, particularly youth unemployment, to a point where basically like well over 50% of the youth just weren't working. It was just an unbelievably nasty situation. And they're still kind of reeling from a lot of those long-term effects. Fiscal crises are not sexy, and they're not good. And it is important, it is not just important, it is essential that the United States structure itself in a way that it has some kind of long-term economic stability. Now, you hear a lot of people talk about the need for fiscal responsibility. We hear those words echoed pretty often, but you don't really see it go in practice. The deficits aren't really going down, not since Obama's second term. We haven't balanced the budget since Bill Clinton. And we see, especially under this term, a level of shamelessness from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that they just completely threw away and practice any level of fiscal responsibility and any concern over the national debt. But eventually, we cannot keep kicking down this road, and eventually we're going to have to confront the fact that aggressive action is necessary. You heard some potential good news or some potential interesting news from Elon Musk and his minions about the Department of Government Efficiency early in this year. You remember that in the lead up to Trump's inauguration day and in the first couple of months, you heard about the Department of Government Efficiency. Whatever happened to that? The idea of the Department of Government Efficiency is that they were going to scroll through the government, they were going to scrounge through the government and find all of this mythical waste, fraud, and abuse that is plaguing government. All of this mythical waste, fraud, and abuse that so many departments were doing, just throwing money away on random crap because there was nobody with any level of accountability holding these people to accountable on all of the wasteful spending that they were doing. And if you looked at the poll numbers at the beginning, there was actually a good amount of optimism and curiosity on what could happen because for the longest time, so many people, not even politically polarized, but a lot of people, regardless of their politics, have believed that government is this wasteful slog that is spending money on just random stuff and they have no audit. So the idea was maybe they could come in and they could do a little bit of disruption and that they could really hold people accountable. And as a return, they could reduce the deficits and potentially even give a dividend back to the taxpayers. but nothing came out of it. When Elon Musk came, he promised that he could do potentially $1 trillion in savings as a result of curbing waste, fraud, and abuse and getting rid of all the random crap that plagued government spending. But what ended up happening is, okay, they canceled a couple contracts that were already paid out, or that was already that funds were already allocated or already promised. So that didn't save very much. They got rid of USAID, foreign aid, which is going to end up long term killing millions of people. And USAID, foreign aid, is not just important for humanitarian reasons, and it is very important for humanitarian reasons in providing a very efficient way of saving lives, is incredibly cost efficient in saving lives in terms of the amount of dollars to save each life. It's not just important for humanitarian reasons, but it's important for foreign policy reasons in making sure that the United States foreign policy is sound and that we have a good reputation abroad. Because when we have programs that help out these communities abroad in these foreign countries, it disincentivizes them from, first of all, having a lot of animosity towards the United States, which means they're less likely to join groups that are hostile to the United States or against our foreign interests. They're more likely to cooperate with us economically down the road. They're less than likely to cooperate with people that are antagonistic to us. It's good for national security reasons. But regardless of all of these benefits, not just for humanitarian and defense reasons, they cut that in significant capacity, over 80%. And so you might ask, okay, how much money did they save? If you're doing all of this, how much money did they save? And it was barely over $1 billion. Let's be clear. The amount of government spending that we have every year is $7 trillion. $1 billion of that is, I believe, 0.014%. It's nothing. It's a rounding error. And I remember reading an article from one of the engineers who worked at Doge, and they said, you know, when I originally came here, I really was bought into this idea that there was a ton of waste, fraud, and abuse in government. And I thought that it actually could be a level of government service, public service, and holding people accountable to make sure that these programs are running clean and efficient. But then I came and I realized that there's actually not that much waste, fraud, and abuse in governments. And this ties into what I would say is probably the adult equivalent of telling people that there's no Santa Claus, the adult equivalent of telling a child that Santa Claus isn't real. And that's that there's not really that much waste, fraud, and abuse in government. It turns out that if you want to cut spending, you actually have to cut spending. And that means cutting 3 programs in some meaningful capacity: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, when you hear this, you start to understand why that waste, fraud, and abuse myth is so prevalent. Why particularly Republicans talk about all this potential waste, fraud, and abuse, all this waste in government. Because what that means is that if you want to promise tax cuts, there's only 2 real ways to pay for it. One, you have to finance it by debt, which, as we've seen increasingly, is going to hurt the long-term health of this country. It's going to lead to decreased economic growth. It's going to lead to increased percentages of our taxpayer revenue that's going towards interest payments. That's not good. It's going to lead to higher interest rates. It's going to lead to an increased chance of fiscal crisis. It's going to lead to an increased chance of insolvency for our elder programs. So, and it's just plain unstable. Everybody knows that getting trillions of dollars in debt is just not sustainable, okay? So that means there's one way, there's 2 reasons. The first way to finance trillions of dollars of tax cuts is going into debt, which we're seeing is very not great. And then the second is that you have to gut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And that is why I'm always skeptical, I'm always suspicious of anybody who's going on and saying, we're just going to do a bunch of tax cuts and we're going to make sure that people can keep more money in their own pocket. Because everybody wants tax cuts. Who doesn't want tax cuts? Who doesn't want free money? Or who doesn't want more money without any anything else. But it turns out that tax cuts aren't free. And if you're doing tax cuts, well, first of all, you'd want them to be in a very controlled manner and very surgical to help the people who want them the most. But in all honesty, if you want to do tax cuts, you have to be willing to be honest and tell people that you're going to gut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in some significant capacity. And not just saying, oh, we're going to get rid of the people who aren't working. Because I believe 3% of Medicaid payouts go to people who aren't working. And a large percentage of those people who aren't working are people who are in the hospital, okay, who can't work. So an overwhelming percentage of Medicaid is already going to people who aren't working. And the way that they cut Medicaid, they say, oh, we're just doing work requirements. The way that they cut Medicaid by introducing work requirements is that they overwhelm people who otherwise should qualify for the program. They overwhelm them with so much paperwork that they just either get exhausted and they just say, I can't fucking do this anymore. Because imagine you get home from a warehouse job or some exhausting job and now you have to read a packet every like 3 months to make sure that you stay on the rolls. And it gets exhausting at one point. So it's either that, or two, they forget to check a box, or they forget to dot an I and cross a T, they forget to do a signature here, and then they get kicked off the rolls. So that's how they do Medicaid cuts. All right, and that's the brutal truth of what has to go to justify tax cuts. And that's what we saw in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They cut $1 trillion off of Medicaid, and then they also exploded the debt to pay for tax cuts for people who don't need them. So we know what the ugly truth is when you do tax cuts, and we know the importance of fiscal responsibility. But what does fiscal responsibility mean in practice? Because the actual real world of applications of fiscal responsibility is considerably more ugly than just simply singing the tune on the campaign trail. It turns out that you have to have some level of fiscal reform. And my idea, first and foremost, is you have to raise the retirement age. You have to raise the retirement age by 3 years. Not 1, not 2, but 3 years. And the reason why I say 3 years instead of 1 or 2 is because that extra year actually matters quite a bit for actuarial reasons. It's important in order to make sure that these programs stay solvent. One of the reasons why we have to pay particular care towards the solvency of our elder care programs is because the United States is facing a problem that many other countries are facing. Actually, to a lesser degree, but it is still facing that. And that is that age demographics are showing that we are going to have a larger and larger percentage of our population that is elderly, because the amount of kids that people are having, the fertility rate is quite low. And so increasingly, what we're projected to have is that we're going to have more and more elderly people on these elder care programs, and then also have less working age people to support them. So it's a whammy on both fronts. And this is going to have a major structural problem for us fiscally. And so in order to address this problem, no amount of tax revenue increases is really going to fix this problem. No amount of cutting to other programs is going to address this. We have to address the problem with elder care insolvency head on. Doing anything else is like putting a Band-Aid on a gash wound. You have to just address this head on. We have to address the fact that there's going to be bloat in elder care programs unless we have some fiscal reforms. And this is what you see in France. This is what you see in Germany, where they're increasing the retirement age because they are finally recognizing that it's just unsustainable. So we have to raise the retirement age. But there's also another thing that we can do. There's another thing in conjunction. And that is de-index social programs from inflation. What does that mean? Well, naturally, a lot of these programs, you want to maintain them in real value so they just get indexed to inflation. But what if we de-index them? What this means is that you're going to have to, if you want these programs to increase, you're going to have to manually increase them. And what we see is, what you could see from doing this, from a system where you de-index them, is that whenever you every so often you manually increase them, either at inflation or perhaps even above inflation, it shows a level of appreciation and it shows an affirmation that you support these programs, that these programs are good, and that they are a program that you really believe are beneficial for creating a more harmonious, a more equitable, a better society. Now, some people might ask, okay, but if you don't index any of these social programs, we're talking programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Veterans Affairs. If you don't index them to inflation, wouldn't that mean that over time they're getting eaten up in real terms? And that's kind of the point. You want to have a little bit of a treadmill effect where the real value of the programs are decreasing over time, and then you manually reaffirm, and then when you increase them manually, you're reaffirming their importance. And what this allows you to do is that some people can recognize, particularly in times of fiscal hardship, in times that you need to cut spending, that there is such thing as bloated government spending, and there is a necessity to make sure that some of these programs are cut a little bit. But they don't want to cut these because kind of a little bit for pride and ideological reasons, where if they cut them, it kind of sends a message that they think that that program or the people that benefit off of them are seen in a bad way. And understandably, they don't want to send that signal. I get that. And so what you can do is have the default kind of that they're decreasing over time. And then every once in a while, when you either want to just increase them to index or you want to increase them past that, it gives you the opportunity to say, I value this program, while kind of like silently letting the programs that perhaps need some real cuts for them to get eaten up a little bit by inflation. I think that would be a good idea. So raising the retirement age and de-indexing social programs from inflation, I think are good ideas. And then let me talk about one last one, and that is Veterans Affairs. Now, Veterans Affairs is probably one of the major third rail issues along with the retirement age. And it's understandable because nobody wants to be seen as anti-veteran, just like nobody wants to be seen as anti-old, It's kind of like, it creates this uncomfortability where whenever you have to address some level of fiscal responsibility in practice, whenever you cut a program, you don't want it to, there's some politics around it being looked at as a negative referendum on the people who benefit from the program. But that's not the case. Unfortunately, to the extent that there is waste, fraud, and abuse in government, if there ever is it in any meaningful capacity, it's going to be in the VA. And the problem is that the quality, the amount of threshold that you have to reach to demonstrate disability or some kind of injury in order to qualify for disability payments in the VA is not as high as perhaps it should be. And so there's some people who they kind of have like a low bit of nick or a not very significant injury. It could be even something as minor as acne. And then they kind of fudge a little bit or kind of, embellish a little bit, and they're able to collect some pretty significant disability checks when perhaps it's not honoring the spirit of what real disability from being a veteran actually means. And I really believe that people who are disabled in significant capacity, absolutely, not even significant capacity, but just, like even minor, but like something like kind of real, those people absolutely should qualify for some level of disability. I believe that. But particularly at the really low ends of the spectrum, there's a level of embellishing that even anybody who sees real world cases of this would say, this doesn't honor the spirit of what this program is about. And the reason why you never see politicians addressing this is because they don't want to be seen as anti-veteran. And I completely understand that. But if you want to make sure that programs are running clean and honest, you do have to address that. Now, I'm not going to really talk about this in an expansive way just yet because I want to read more about it to make sure that I really know what I'm talking about before I talk about this more conclusively. But I think that some trimming around the edges or some actual real reform on Veterans Affairs is probably needed. So those are my thoughts on some things that we could do to actually make fiscal responsibility, good governance real. Because I wouldn't want it to just be some slogan. It needs to be something that's done in practice. It's when you're governing, sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Everybody, when their idea of saying, oh, we're going to be a good president, they think we're going to do $5 trillion of tax cuts. Anybody can do tax cuts. Saying that you're going to make sure everybody gets to keep more money in their pocket, that's easy, okay? It's easy. Going to parades and cutting ribbons, that's easy. But true governance means understanding that sometimes you're going to have to make difficult decisions of which you might incur some level of short-term blowback in order to ensure some long-term sustainability in the future. Maybe the next administration is going to have it way easier than you did. Maybe the next generations of people are going to be able to live in a country where they're not going to have to worry about bond markets or insolvency because you took the necessary steps beforehand. I think that is the true test of governance. And a lot of politicians understandably do not want to confront that because it could be potentially harmful for their elections. And so they'll kind of kick the can down the road, sing sweet tunes, and let it be that way. But I don't think that is responsible. I think we need to kind of change the way that we fundamentally engage with politics in a way that's perhaps a little bit more honest and kind of cutting through the BS and recognizing that not everything that you do as in government is going to be popular. That doesn't mean you start doing a bunch of unpopular policies, but if there's something that is truly important and truly necessary, sometimes you have to be doing that even understanding that there's going to be short-term blowback. Those are my thoughts. Now, if you notice, I think we're gonna see that the quality of this video might be a little bit different than others. I'm using Apple Log, and I hope that it's gonna allow the video footage to be a little bit better than some of the ones that we've seen in the past. Perhaps we'll see that, perhaps we'll not, but I'm gonna test it out and I think it's gonna be pretty cool. So that's all I've got for today. That's my position on fiscal responsibility and good governance, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.